Welcome to American National Government. In this course, you will discuss the purpose, structure, and evolution of United States government.
I'm Jordan O'Connell, History and Government Instructor at Northeast Iowa Community College. This lecture distills a decade of my written notes taken from American Government, Roots and Reform American Government by Lenz and Holman, and our course-assigned OpenStax American Government textbook. This lecture focuses on Article 2 and the growth of executive energy. The core question is this: how much power should a president be able to claim before energy in the executive starts looking like a constitutional license to outrun the legislature? The core competency is to outline the major duties of the American president and the functions of the executive branch. How much power should a president be able to claim before energy in the executive starts looking like a constitutional license to outrun the legislature? The pressure moves through Article 2, text, appointments, command authority, emergency claims, and the duty to execute law without swallowing legislative power. The presidency is easy to misread as a personality contest because one person speaks for the office. That habit clouds the real structure of the institution. The presidency carries force because the Constitution created a single executive who can direct a large administrative machine, command the armed forces, speak for the nation abroad, and become the visible target for public hope and blame. Citizens who keep their eyes on the person alone miss the office and the machinery that make the person consequential. Article 2 starts with striking brevity. Article 1 sprawls across legislative procedure, powers, and limits. Article 2 gives the president fewer words and broader space, and that economy created one of the most consequential ambiguities in American government. The Constitution does not define executive power with the same itemized detail it uses for many congressional powers. It vests executive power in the president, names specific tools such as the veto, pardon, appointment power, and commander-in-chief role, and then leaves later generations to argue about what falls inside the office because the other branches could not, would not, or did not act fast enough. Article 2 begins with what looked like a constitutional clerk and became a modern commander. The framers wanted one executive because unity promised speed, secrecy, and accountability. They did not want a committee presidency. They also did not build the modern White House staff, national security apparatus, or administrative presidency into the document. Those grew later as the nation expanded, crises intensified, and Congress delegated more discretion. Americans demand fast executive action and then worry, often after the fact, that the office now holds tools too large for Republican comfort. The civic problem is straightforward and sharp. Should citizens treat the presidency as a narrow constitutional office whose main job is faithful execution of law, or as the practical command center for any problem that demands visible national response? The answer carries force because every modern expectation placed on the office tends to enlarge the machine behind it. The framers did not choose a single president by accident. They had lived through monarchy, but they had also lived through the weakness of the Articles of Confederation. They distrusted concentrated power and administrative drift at the same time. A plural executive might restrain one-person ambition, yet it might also blur accountability, delay response, and encourage internal deadlock during war or diplomacy. A legislature-dominated executive would tie energy too tightly to a large deliberative body, so the convention made a choice that shaped the whole course of American government. One president, not many. Alexander Hamilton defended that choice in Federalist No. 70 by arguing that unity promotes energy. He linked energy to dispatch, secrecy, and decisiveness. Those words stopped sounding ornamental when placed inside actual government problems. An army cannot wait for 6 co-equal executives to agree during an invasion. A diplomatic signal loses value if foreign governments cannot tell who speaks for the United States. A large administrative apparatus can evade blame if responsibility disappears into a board structure. Hamilton did not celebrate speed for its own sake. He wanted a design where citizens could identify who acted and judge that person clearly. Yet the framers did not hand the president a free-floating national guardianship. Congress writes statutes, appropriates money, declares war, and establishes offices. The Senate confirms many appointments and ratifies treaties. Courts review executive action when cases arise. The original office was energetic inside a system of rivalry. The problem came later when citizens kept demanding executive initiative while the rest of government often preferred delay, fragmentation, or symbolic conflict. This is where the phrase, whatever the other branches could not or would not do, becomes useful. When Congress moves slowly, presidents fill the silence with executive orders, administrative direction, public bargaining, and emergency claims. When foreign affairs demand rapid recognition or military signaling, presidents act because one officer can act faster than 535 legislators. When bureaucracies require coordination, presidents become managers of an apparatus the Constitution barely sketches. The modern presidency did not arrive in one constitutional amendment. It accumulated through need, delegation, crisis, and habit. The office also expanded because the public learned to expect national performance from the president. Citizens do not usually turn first to committee chairs during disasters. They look to the White House. They do not expect an agency administrator to frame a national tragedy morally and politically. They expect the president. That expectation adds informal power. It also adds informal pressure to use power even when the legal tools are partial or uncertain. The Philadelphia Convention built Article 2 through argument over dependence and energy. Delegates rejected direct congressional selection for life, rejected a plural executive, and settled on an electoral college system that filtered popular choice through state-based electors. They paired that arrangement with Senate confirmation for appointments, treaty ratification, and impeachment as a removal mechanism. The text that emerged was thin by design. It gave the office unity, a 4-year term, a qualified veto, command of the armed forces, and a duty to execute law, then left practice to determine how far those clauses could travel once foreign affairs, party politics, and administrative growth tested them. George Washington set early precedents because someone had to decide what a new executive would actually do. He assembled a cabinet, even though the Constitution does not spell out a modern cabinet structure. He asserted authority in foreign affairs and insisted on executive dignity without claiming royal status. Those moves proved consequential because the first office holder taught later office holders how elastic the office might become. Presidents after Washington kept adding layers. A president, as commander-in-chief, directs the armed forces, but civilian control does not mean solitary control. Orders move through the Secretary of Defense, combatant commands, intelligence structures, procurement systems, and legal review channels. A president as chief diplomat does not negotiate alone. Ambassadors, the State Department, trade officials, intelligence agencies, and national security staff all carry parts of the diplomatic load. A president as chief executive does not personally inspect food plants, review every social security file, or clear each immigration case. Departments and agencies perform those tasks. The president supplies priorities, appointments, and directional pressure. That distinction carries force because responsibility and personal execution are different things. The office is one node atop a layered chain of command. Cabinet secretaries translate political goals into departmental choices. White House staff screen information, manage schedules, coordinate policy, and shape what reaches the Oval Office at all. The Office of Management and Budget reviews proposed agency rules, budget requests, and administrative priorities. The National Security Council channels military and diplomatic information. The machine lets one office influence enormous policy space without physically performing the underlying work. The veto shows how the office reaches back into legislation. A president can reject a bill and force Congress to reach a higher threshold. Even when a president never issues the veto, the threat of veto shapes bargaining. Members ask what language the president will sign, what changes might avoid rejection, and whether the coalition can survive an override attempt. The appointment power works the same way. It shapes courts, departments, commissions, and enforcement habits for years. Pardons demonstrate another hard edge of the office. A president can forgive federal crimes or reduce punishment even when judges, prosecutors, and agencies have already spent years on a case. That power can correct injustice, display mercy, or appear to protect allies. The point is not that pardons are good or bad in the abstract. The point is that Article 2 arms one office with a concentrated instrument that can disrupt many other actors at once. Executive duty is best viewed through institutional channels, not charisma. The president recommends measures to Congress, but staff draft many details. The president commands the military, but logistics and legality run through large structures. The president directs administration, but the civil service and regulatory state give that direction form. Judging the office requires asking who carried the instruction, through which legal instrument, under what limit, and with what practical consequence. In Philadelphia in 1787 and in the ratification struggle that followed, Article 2 functioned like a pressure draft. The opening line, "The executive power shall be vested in a president," gave advocates of executive energy a phrase broad enough to defend initiative, secrecy, and command. Critics saw the same line and heard an opening for elective monarchy. That fight never vanished because the clause never cataloged executive power the way Article 1 cataloged legislative power. The commander-in-chief language carried the same tension into military affairs. The words gave the president command, but they did not give the office appropriations, declarations of war, or the power to raise armies. Those powers stayed with Congress. The ink therefore split force from authorization on purpose. Presidents could later point to commander-in-chief when speed seemed essential. Congress could answer that command without legislative backing was only half a constitutional title. The Take Care Clause sharpened the bargaining over administration. Take care that the laws be faithfully executed sounds restrained until execution means tariffs at dozens of ports, treaty enforcement, militia calls, banking supervision, sanctions administration, intelligence coordination, and, in the modern state, millions of employees and thousands of regulations. Lawyers, judges, and presidents keep returning to those words because they can sound like duty, supervision, or control, depending on who needs the office to move. The veto clause armed the president inside legislative struggle without making the president a legislator. A bill could clear both houses and still come back with objections in presidential handwriting. That device forced Congress to think ahead about coalition strength, override math, and what language the executive would tolerate. Article 2, therefore, did more than describe an office. It handed one official a set of textual levers that could slow, redirect, or intensify the work of the other branches. The deeper tension sits in the design itself. The Constitution created a single accountable executive, and that same unity made accumulation easier once the public began pushing every urgent national problem toward the White House. Article 2 did not script the modern executive machine, but it supplied the phrases later office holders used whenever they wanted the office to move first and explain later. The office of the president now sits at the center of American expectations because Americans ask it to do contradictory things. They want speed in crisis and restraint in calm. They want decisive leadership and careful legality. They want personal accountability for agency failure, even when Congress wrote the bad statute or refused the necessary funding. Every one of those expectations adds pressure to enlarge executive initiative. That does not mean growth is always illegitimate. A large commercial republic, standing military establishment, national security apparatus, and administrative state require coordination. Someone must prioritize, appoint, direct, and answer publicly. Yet that practical case does not erase the constitutional danger. When the president becomes the bucket for every unresolved national problem, the office can absorb powers and expectations that the document never enumerated clearly. Personal ranking is a weak first mode of analysis. A narrower and better question asks what tool the office used. An executive order, an appointment, a veto threat, a military directive, a public message, or an administrative review process. The next questions follow naturally. Which statute or clause supported the act? Which department carried it forward? Which branch could resist? Those questions reveal the office as a machine of command rather than a stage for personality. The unresolved judgment remains live. Does the modern presidency solve the problem of accountability by placing action in one visible office, or does it conceal responsibility by letting one office claim success for what thousands do and dodge failure by blaming the other branches? The answer depends on whether citizens judge the president by theater or by the legal and administrative instruments actually used. The unresolved question is whether executive energy can stay constitutional once every crisis rewards speed more than restraint.
If you're curious how I'm using AI to build these lectures and reshape higher education, visit thelibertytolearn.com. I'll see you in class.